Hey everybody, welcome back to Anecdotes and Observations, that is AO! For those who have not been back and are not familiar with it, I didn't tell these guys because I wanted to actually surprise them with that strangeness. So I'm here in Tasmania with Dr. Joe Klimczewski, the godfather, the other godfather, not Jeff Alberts. I'd say maybe the grandfather, I don't want to offend you though. The oldest person ever I've met in my life. No, I'm just kidding. The original OG of online fitness coaching for bodybuilding, and probably the first person who inspired my career when I was reading his work in Natural Bodybuilding and Fitness magazine, and some of the progenitor, I would say, of the modern contest prep peaking strategies. So I was talking to Dr. Joe. We just had a seminar here at KFM Fitness with Calculated Fitness, Callan Richardson. Thank you for having us.
Pleasure.
And a big conversation we had was around peaking and just how that's evolved over time. And what more anecdotal than peaking, which is totally based on the observations and the things that we can extrapolate from research. So, Dr. Joe, if you don't mind giving a brief introduction of yourself to those who might not be familiar.
Hey guys, pleasure to be here. I've known Eric for quite a while. We've stayed in touch a little bit as his career has grown and he's been busy working on his academic career, but just an absolute pleasure to be here. As I mentioned, that Callan Richardson, just through our social media, has invited us to be a part of his first annual fitness and training camp. So definitely fun to be here in Tasmania. And I actually said to Callan, if we have anybody join us, it has to be Dr. Eric Helm. So yeah, wanted to spend some time and get to know Eric a little bit more now that he's doing so much work in the field of academics. So as you said, I have just kind of been busy building my company and taking care of Diet Doc program owners around the world, but back in the day, going back a little bit more than probably 20, 22 years ago, started writing about peaking principles and observations and anecdotes for Natural Bodybuilding magazines, and that just kind of created a pretty big wake, I think, for the industry to evolve as social media and communication just changed, as all of mediums grew, connecting everybody. It just became easier for this as an industry to explode.
Right. I think so much of bodybuilding is rooted in the best guesses of athletes and coaches, and I always try not to disparage what came before too much, but it's easy to have kind of the rosy colored shades and look back and go, that really didn't make any sense. That's a semi-right biochemical understanding of things and then extrapolated too far and then lacking some common sense. But then again, you have to start somewhere. So when you first got into the game, what was the standard peaking practice that most bodybuilders would use?
I remember when I was probably 12 or 13 years old, I started training and created a goal where I wanted to, very naively, wanted to compete before I was 21. I wanted to be a pro by the time I was 30. And at that point, I don't think I even knew the difference between drug-free and enhanced bodybuilding. So I just assumed at 12 years old, if I trained hard enough, I could look like Lee Haney.
Yeah.
And so that was my goal. As the paths kind of converged into natural bodybuilding, I did meet those goals, becoming a pro at 27. But along the way, after competing in my first show at 20, I got involved with some drug-free organizations, and they were always looking to expand and to have shows anywhere they want. So it's pretty common practice even today to try to recruit promoters and just expand that organization. So by the time I was 25, I was already promoting my own contest.
Yeah.
So I had a front row seat to a lot of athletes. And I certainly was not coaching or peaking anybody at that time,
Right.
But very curiously, I was just really hounding people to find out what they did. And the common answer, of course, very similar to my personal experience, was I never get it right. I never look great the day of the show, but for some reason I look good the day before, the day after. So academically, I was already in some different pursuits physiologically. I was in a pre-med track, moved into physical therapy, then did some graduate work in nutrition. And so along the way, that's when it started not making sense.
Right.
If you completely deplete yourself of water and you look flat the day of the show, that seemed to be pretty correlational. If you're absolutely just emaciating yourself at the beginning of the week with carb depletion and then carbing up to the point you spill over, trying to time that didn't quite make sense. So I really just started doing some experimenting, and it took several years of self-experimentation before I started maybe being asked by clients, to peak them for contests.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't sound like things changed that much for years, because I mean, when you were 25, what year was it? If you don't mind me exposing your age to the audience.
93, 4, 5, somewhere there.
Sure. So when I was first getting into the scene and looking at this stuff in 2005, 2006, people were still carb deplete, carb load potassium, drop sodium,
Right.
cut water. It hasn't
Absolutely.
changed at all. And there were some minor spins on that. Some people would backload, some people would kind of do a load, drop, load, but they still did those same kind of key principles. And like you, I was just shocked that even at the highest level, it seemed like it was a huge guessing game.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I watched the Olympia on live stream one year, and I think Jay Cutler ended up, it's either one of the years he placed second, there's many, or one of the years he won. And he didn't have a very good showing at the night show, and he got off the stage, got interviewed, and they asked him what he did, and his overall response was, I never know how it's going to go. And at that point, I was just like, there's got to be a better way. That's Mr. Olympia, and he has no idea what's happening, and he looks discouraged, and he can't get it right.
I remember at the shows I was doing, because at the time I was, married, no kids, had more time to compete, and it was you would wake up the morning of the show and run to the mirror to see if it worked. Whatever you tried, whatever little nuance you changed, even though those common principles were the same. Carb deplete, carb load, water deplete, sodium load, all that stuff.
Yeah.
You were hoping somehow the result changed a little bit, even though you did almost everything the same. And of course, everybody's always disappointed.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in my perception, the things that started to change were you, and Lane Norton started promoting the idea of, hey, why are you changing so much? And then, I talked to Jeff Alberts, and his experience was the same thing. He started competing in the early 90s and tried everything under the book and under the sun. And eventually he just kind of got to the point where he was like, why am I changing things? I look great at some random point 3 weeks out. And I think that ushered in an era where people were just like, just don't change anything, and maybe just take yourself out of a deficit. And I think that was that seems like a very logical response to having it basically be like, roll the dice and see what happens, is to then go into a phase of, hey, just get really lean, and that's 99% of it, and then just don't be totally dead going into it. Don't fall across the finish line, and don't change anything. And I think that's a really reasonable response, and I think that's probably a better option than rolling the dice, obviously. But I've seen in my own career and with 3DMJ and seeing yourself over your years of doing, I guess, the latter half of your career, and with Lane and others like Cliff Wilson, that I think as we get a little more experienced and then start doing more controlled experiments versus changing everything and having no idea what did what, that there are things you can do to make a pretty significant impact. And I know in what we do with 3DMJ, it often looks, more often now it's looking more like a semi-aggressive backload. But we always try to eat people up into a show, and then we typically are giving them sodium and not cutting water. And that's a pretty consistent formula we've found to people to look better than that random 3 weeks out time point. So I guess that's been a little very short snippet of our evolution and practices at 3DMJ. What does it look like for you? Where did you start and where have you gotten to?
Yeah, my very first intentional experiment was 1993, so exactly 25 years ago. I had quit competing for a while because, first of all, I was kind of discouraged. I was competing in NPC shows as a small, drug-free young guy, but I got busy with school, and so I was digging into school. I was at the IU Med Center in Indianapolis, and I just happened to see a flyer for a drug-free show. And at that time, that was the first I had ever heard of a drug-free show. And again, just having the history of being disillusioned by the way my body had responded before to traditional peaking, I had just kind of that realization that physiologically it just makes sense to keep water in and so forth. So I created my first exact peak week plan to kind of buck all of those trends, and I won that show. So,
Awesome.
it was kind of enlightening because it wasn't just a win.
Mm-hmm.
I really looked my best. I maintained fullness because I was not dehydrated and so forth. So then I got pretty excited and kind of kept competing. So then I was ramping up a little bit with some experimentation. And I remember my very first client was probably about 2 years later, and it was a young guy who I had competed against in this little drug-free organization. I mean, he was a teenager at the time. I was probably in my early 20s, and he would always beat me because he was just a better bodybuilder.
Yeah.
But at a show I promoted, he won, and he won his pro card, and he looked like shit because he was still so flat. I could tell he was using that traditional peaking method. He was so good that he was able to win, but he was going to turn around and compete in his first pro show 2 months later, and I said, wow, I would love to help you. Like, I've got some things that I've learned that I think can help you. And so he went into the WNBF Mr. International. To his credit, he trusted me, even though it sounds very iffy. Here's everything I've ever done. I just won my pro card. Now you want me to actually drink water. You want me to keep sodium in. And he won the lightweight class as a pro.
Wow.
With a pretty small frame. I mean, kind of an ectomorph. So at that point, I was writing for Natural Bodybuilding Fitness magazine, and this story had to be told, in my opinion. Look, everybody in the world has been doing this wrong. I have some information to share.
Right.
And so it was 1998 when I started writing on peaking, and that kind of continued for 10, 15 years through the Natural Bodybuilding magazines.
Right. So what are the big things that have changed, or I guess been fine-tuned? Because it sounded like you had a lot right, or at least you eliminated what was almost everything wrong.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. How have you fine-tuned that process over time? What have been the big light bulb moments in your career?
So I think in the beginning, I still was a little bit blasé about sodium. The first big pillar for me was just keeping water in.
Yeah.
And I probably still was a little hesitant to add sodium, and so that didn't happen until years later. I definitely created kind of an undulating carb load. It again, just understanding the physiology of carb assimilation and how carb sensitive some people were at spilling over. It just didn't make sense to do this depletion and then massive backload when you're so carb sensitive from the dieting process and then from a depletion phase. So I started almost wanting to be a little bit carb loaded at the beginning of the week. So you would call that kind of a front load, but not extreme.
Right.
I just wanted to find that ceiling. I wanted to get somebody to the point where they were just about to spill over, but then how could we kind of maintain that? Maybe come down just a little bit so we can siphon off some of that subcutaneous water from any spillover, and then ramp back up. So probably for 10 or 15 years, I helped clients do quite well with that kind of a small undulation. But it was still very discouraging that if a client couldn't nail it perfectly, they were still getting kind of a same result, very much like what I had tried to bring the industry out of. They were just a little bit flat, maybe a little bit soft, and so why was it working for 75% of the people, but still not the rest? And so gradually, I started moving sodium in a little bit to stay tight, but I also found that the more consistent you can keep somebody's peak week, and this probably didn't happen until about the last 5 years, you can really control that better, because homeostatically, if you're creating any kind of undulating model throughout the week, you're still going to have some reaction and reaction to that reaction that you have to time, and that's just difficult.
Right.
If you can eliminate that, it's a lot easier. So now I do what I call a progressive linear load, which is start pretty moderate. I mean, if somebody's carbohydrate and calorie intake is here leading into the show or peak week, I'll increase a little bit and just start to try and find a line where we're at least keeping them full, getting them a little bit fuller without spilling over. By the time they get to the contest, they have enough of a glycogen base that you can just load a little bit more water, maybe a little more sodium. Those are the most responsive things to looking better instantly.
Yeah.
And then in the last day or contest day, if you need a little bit more calorie intake, a little bit more carb or fat, you still can't get that big of a response that quickly, but it just allows you to be ramping up toward the contest and maintain a much more predictable look.
Yeah. I mean, that very much falls in line with what we've observed. Like, when we can get someone ready early, which you don't always get the opportunity to, just if someone contacts you and they're way too heavy for the amount of time you have. But if you can get them ready early, even 2-3 weeks in advance, everything becomes so much more predictable. You know, you can drop cardio down, you can reduce the calorie deficit, their training goes better, and they have much more reasonable food intake. And you know, armchair endocrinologists, I'm assuming their cortisol levels are lower, so you're seeing this less total body water retention. I know when I'm in the deepest, darkest phase of my preps, and this is true of most of my clients, and you're very lean, but you're working hard to get that way, you see these minute changes in the way your body looks almost a daily or sometimes hourly basis. You might be shredded and have striated glutes, but your ankles are swollen on a random Thursday. And I noticed that if you can have the time to just start feeding up and getting out of that deficit, all that becomes way more predictable. And so I think my experience would bear that process out as well. But if you can just kind of keep ramping things up, A, you don't need to go as extreme in your peak week. You don't need to replenish something that isn't that depleted. And then you don't have to juggle a variable you're not used to. And then C, you've already done most of the work. Right. I think I went A to C there, but you know.
Well, you know, I see peak week. For me now, the peaking process is really almost a month.
Right.
Preferably. You know, definitely you have to make sure that final week you're fine tuning everything. But my most profound or decisive wins with clients are the people who can be ready 4 to 6 weeks early, and then we're ramping food intake up. And these are some outliers. I mean, for some people it may be that you're raising carbs 25 or 50 grams gradually. Other people, I have doubled their calories in a course of 6 weeks. And when you're at off-season maintenance levels of calories and you're still that lean, you completely reduced carb sensitivity. You, like you said, you don't have to do anything that extreme. And now you've got somebody who has that kind of fullness, that kind of anabolic environment going into the show, instead of trying to nosedive into, you know, depletion and survival mode.
Absolutely. I mean, so much of the reason why you don't quite look that good all the time during contest prep is because of what you had to do to get there. So if you remove everything that required you to get there, and you're back at the max food levels you can have at that body fat percentage and the minimal amount of cardio, then it would make sense that you've removed all those confounding stressors. So I think that's something I can't think of anyone who wouldn't agree with that. Like, no, I fit people up and they just look bad. You know, this doesn't work. You know, they need to be doing a lot of cardio and really like having terrible sleep to look good.
Isn't it amazing academically though? If this was a 20 to 25 year span of growth, I mean, look at how long people were doing all of the antithetical things that we're discussing, and they just trusted it, just kind of gambled, and going through kind of a filter of just hundreds and hundreds of coaches and articles and social media content to get to a point where we say, yeah, this makes total sense. Why would you not do this? And I'm sure there will be ways that people try and push the boundaries, and I think there's room to explore a little bit more. But yeah, I can't think of anything more physiologically sound than what we're describing.
And I think that's why the old practices held on for so long, is because they were based in, I would say, the incorrect interpretation of physiology. They're based on the sodium potassium pump.
Right.
And then you just take a few leaps of not fully understanding that intracellular is not the same thing as intramuscular, and extracellular is not the same thing as subcutaneous. And your vascular system is actually extracellular. And of course, oh wait, if I have high sodium, I have a higher blood pressure acutely. How am I going to get a pump if I have low sodium? Like you're not wrong about the sodium potassium pump. You're just wrong about what that actually means in terms of, you know, carb loading and manipulating electrolytes. So I kind of get it. Like, if everyone's doing it, and if it makes sense on paper, and if everyone's doing it, that means the people who have the biggest, leanest physiques still win. They just don't look as good as they do on, you know, Sunday night after their binge.
I always imagined, and speaking of anecdotal, I do not have any evidence of this, but I always imagined somebody in the 1950s or 60s, you know, reading this physiology textbook without having the actual education to understand it, looking at a chart or a diagram and saying, wow, this makes sense, let's jam, you know, all this sodium in first, and then we'll take it out, and we'll have this great, you know, super compensation effect. Again, if you don't understand physiology, you could make that argument that it makes sense.
Too reductionist, really.
Right.
Another one I've always wondered is, you know, I think back at the history of anabolic steroid use, and it started with highly anabolic and androgenic drugs, and there weren't these distinctions in how complicated it is now. And I know a lot of the peaking protocols that are used in bodybuilding as a whole, on both sides of enhanced and the drug-free, are inherited from kind of that era. So it makes me wonder if there's guys running D-ball all the way into a show. Maybe they did look net better at cutting water. And sometimes I wonder if that's just a holdover from like the 70s.
100%.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too.
No question.
So are there any other things related to peaking that you see as critical, maybe around like training or cardio that people have traditionally done that you think need to be re-examined? Or
Yeah, I really think, as at least I started progressing through my methodology, it was water and then the whole carbohydrate system. But another thing that I probably changed maybe midway through that was the training. I still believed for many years that you should probably kind of rest those last couple days. And I just saw a lot of people a little filmy, not quite as tight, that crispness you see. You can be completely depleted, you can be training legs. Everybody, for some reason, thinks, you shouldn't train legs for a week. But I would be completely shredded for a show, train legs, and the next day my legs looked amazing in the mirror. And I thought, why do people stop training legs? And then you just get that little filminess. So just guessing, I thought maybe because of the glycogen and water turnover, when you're constantly training and then eating and you're using glycogen, water follows solutes, so you're going through that process. If all of a sudden you just don't do anything for a couple days, and we know muscle glycogen is pretty static, you have to use that muscle tissue through repeated contraction to use that glycogen. Why are we not doing that leading up to the show? So I started experimenting with people training the day before the show, kind of keeping their training about the same, maybe a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so you get some rest and recovery. And then at some point with some clients who had a very difficult time maintaining tightness the day of the show, they may wake up pretty tight because of lymphatic reabsorption and all that, and then they just can't hold that all day long. Right. I started experimenting with training and doing cardio the morning of the show with tremendous results, because you can use some of that glycogen, you can get rid of some of that subcutaneous and intramuscular water, eat, reabsorb some of that glycogen, start pulling water into the musculature. And I think as a kind of a great side consequence, that level of increasing your body's thermogenesis in the morning, at least your body temperature, just allowed clients to start evaporating more subcutaneous water throughout the day. And so clients who might see their abs and their quads just get a little bit blurry throughout the day, they were maintaining tightness all day long. So tanning product is a challenge, but I do see that clients who have a very difficult time holding that tightness can do really well training, or even just doing a pretty good cardio in the morning, 15 or 20 minute jog for a mile, get your body temperature up, sweat a little bit, take a shower, eat breakfast, and then all of a sudden it's like boom, they're filling up and they maintain that tightness.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense culturally, both why bodybuilders initially said we've got to stay away from legs, and then also what you're talking about is where bodybuilders never venture, which is a moderation. Like the standard bodybuilding leg workout, I think, typically if you wrote it down, like what's your goal? To feel like I can't walk the next day, and that bleeds into multiple days. I mean, I think if you're causing so much muscle damage that there's like truly actual cellular disruption, edema, and you can't, your cells actually can't hold, like the stuff you're trying to load, then maybe you shouldn't do that. But that doesn't mean you can't do a heavy pump session, or a leg extension, leg curl, leg press circuit, or something like that. And I think probably that's one of those things, if you can't observe something, you never try. So if you're not going to go in and do just a wussy leg session on Thursday or something like that, then how would you know? Or even, like you said, Saturday morning.
Now, I will say, you brought up a good point. That is how I progressed. If you looked at peak week protocols I might have written 15 or 20 years ago, I would have clients, wake up, do a little walk, do a few sets, and then eat. And my goal was to just create that environment to pull glucose and water in. And that just wasn't quite enough. And that's when I went to an actual workout. 30 minutes, you're not doing 30 sets of squats, but you're really getting warm, your heart rate's up, you're sweating as long as the tanning product is not an issue. And it does work for some people. I mean, again, anecdote being what it is, everybody does have a different response. We have different body types, metabolic capacities, even show to show. Our body's probably responding a little different because of the context we're in.
Sure.
But as long as you can keep the core principles where they are, and they're just not antithetical to these big homeostatic ranges. I think you can micromanage some of those fine-tuning type variables and still be able to come out with a very good outcome.
Awesome.
My goal, of course, as I tell clients, is, you know, we can almost guarantee that you're going to be 95% your best. I want to get as close to 100 as possible.
Yeah.
But you can't cross that line into spilling over or doing something you cannot rectify. So we're shooting for that range.
Yeah.
It's no longer just I'm gonna wake up and hope something worked.
Let's roll the dice, baby. Yeah. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that falls in line with a lot of. I'm always heartened when my anecdotes and observations line up with someone else's who has a different perspective from a very different, you know, not entirely different. We both work with bodybuilders, but different, I'd say, social groups who get attracted to you, and you have different training environments. Like I know we had a lot of different discussions around the way we train clients. It's a little different, and our dieting principles are similar, but they are different to some degree. So to see what we're kind of operating in two crossing over but different Venn diagrams, and we do have the same observations of peaking, it can give you a little more confidence that your observations might have some merit and real truth, if you will.
I do like with the explosion of coaches out there and everybody scrambling to do different things. It's such a different world. You know, we've talked about what it was like 20 years ago versus now, and talk about elevating an entire sport. Yeah, it's almost like you know, golf. If technology increases and everybody's using the same driver or so forth, you know, why can they hit a drive 350 yards today versus 200 yards 30 years ago? Yeah. Well, if everybody has access to that technology, it's just going to allow the human experience to be that much greater for everybody.
Absolutely.
And it's still competitive. You know, it's still the best coach, the best clients are going to, you know, win. And so it's fun to see that, you know, moving through this industry.
I totally agree. Well, cool, man. Thank you for your time. And we will see you next time on AO. It won't be as good because I won't have him around, but you can listen to me ramble after I work out.